Anyway, thank you very much, Nora. It's an honor. It's an honor to be here in Pembroke College. A special thanks to Mariana and Nikolai for bringing us together. I was speaking with someone from back home last night, saying, I'm sure Mariana and Nikolai chose scholars because of their academic interests and synergy, but they also chose a remarkable group of kind people as well. And it goes for everyone who's been here. I think there's a spirit of fellowship, which I really appreciate, because in the end, the scholarly task is one of a community where we correct and encourage one another. As you see, I'm going to speak about Surah 3, and I'm going to make I'm going to sort of walk through the last 25 verses and sort of imply along the way that there's perhaps a way of reading this section, and by implication maybe other sections of the text as well, at a sort of distance if one is attentive to the motivation of the Qur'anic authors. So let's go ahead and begin. Surah 3 of the Qur'an, Al-Imran, is generally connected by traditional and academic scholars to particular events from the Medinan period of Muhammad's biography. It is often seen to be God's response, or Muhammad's response, to the Battle of Uhud and various events and problems in the new Muslim community in Medina, maybe around the years 625 or 626 CE. A section in the first part of this surah that involves Mary, including her nativity and youth, and Jesus is said to have been revealed or proclaimed during the visit of a delegation of Christians to Medina from the southern Arabian city of Najran. But in this presentation, I will discuss the last section of the surah and emphasize the way in which this section presents an argument, above all, to exhort the new community of believers to remain faithful and obedient to Muhammad. So the attention I will propose, even when it's invoking outsiders, the attention of the Qur'an is with the insiders. While this section does discuss unbelievers and people of the book, it's concerned above all with an exhortation that I would make akin to the genre of late antique homiletics or preaching. I will focus, as I mentioned, on the last 25 verses of Al-Imran. I started writing an outline of the talk, but it's kind of disappointing because that's kind of it. I mean, I felt like I had to put in one more thing, so I put in reward, but that's just the last slide and just the conclusion. So there's that. Okay, let's begin just by noting here the standard way of dividing the surah among Western scholars. At least, now this section is not clearly set off from what precedes it. That is, it's a bit arbitrary for me to begin my analysis at verse 176. But in these last 25 verses, there is a particular focus on the punishment of unbelievers and the reward of believers. And so we'll see what we can make of this section by also being attentive to the rest of the surah and other prominent themes in the Qur'an. And throughout this walkthrough of the last 25 verses, I'll be particularly concerned with what we can deduce of the author's motivation, or put as a question, what is the author hoping to achieve with his audience through these 25 verses? And in this regard, the verse 176, so the first verse that we'll consider here really, even though 175 is there too, is particularly illuminating. Let me just pull up all of the text here. So now the typical way of understanding verses such as 176, I've included 175 because I'll refer back to that, but verses such as 176, which have the divine voice addressing Muhammad alone in the second person singular, and here's, I know I may get some grief for quoting Arbery's translation, but here's one advantage of Arbery using antiquated language. So the reference there is in the second person singular, let them not grieve thee. A typical way of understanding this sort of locution in the Qur'an is that God is consoling his prophet, Muhammad. One often reads that at a moment when this sort of verse was revealed to him, Muhammad was distraught or worried or in despair, and that for various reasons, and God, attentive to his inner state of concern or worry, seeks to encourage him and intervenes by sending him a message to him. In this case, God encourages Muhammad with the message that even if, as we will see, some folks around him deny or are maybe lukewarm in their affirmation that he is a prophet, their denial will not harm God. Instead, God will punish them for their unbelief in hellfire. And so you see there the reference to a mighty chastisement at the end of the verse, and then this is repeated, azab is the Arabic word, this is repeated again in verse 177 with a different description of the nature of the chastisement, translated by Arbery as a painful chastisement. I think it's alim there in verse 177. In any case, this sort of understanding that God is intervening in response to Muhammad's inner state is found not only among, say, confessional works meant for believers, but also in academic scholarship and almost universally. So, to give an example, sort of on one end of the academic spectrum in the field of Quranic studies, Carlos Segovia, in a quite untheological or non-confessional work, Le Coran des Historiens, as the title implies, he says about such verses, he's commenting here actually about verses 183 to 185, but similar kind of vibe there. He says, well, these verses are meant to comfort the Quranic prophet. Similarly, Droge, who I alluded to before when I gave the breakdown of the last 25 verses, Arthur Droge, another translator of the Quran, in his description of this unit of the surah, he describes this as encouragement to the prophet. But let us think through for a moment what such a reading or understanding of such verses implies. By this reading, Muhammad really was sad or distressed at a certain moment, so this would be some time, maybe one particular day, let's say in the year 626, just kind of randomly. He was frustrated either, and the Mufassirun actually differ on this, because his own people back in Mecca still had not converted, and indeed were fighting against him, or because the people of the book in Medina, who should know that he is a prophet because their own scriptures speak of him, did not recognize him as a prophet. This emotional state led God to intervene, to send to him, and really just to him, so directed at Muhammad, a special message of encouragement. Some, although not all, would assume that the very Arabic words that we read today, although I didn't check, there may be some variants in the Qira'at literature, were heard by Muhammad on that day in 626. So he heard, وَلَا يَحْزُنَّ الَّذِينَ يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْكُفْرِ, etc. So he heard these words and he was comforted by them. But at the same time, we might note by taking a step back that in terms of this verse's literary qualities, the language is identical to those verses that are phrased as messages to all of the Qur'an's audience, to the believers. For example, this private message given to Muhammad still rhymes with the public messages, either in the third person or the second person plural around it. So the verse immediately before, verse 175, is directed in the plural. So we find there, وَلَا تَخَافُوهُمْ, and وَخَافُونَ, etc. And then we find that the end of that verse 175, in kuntum mu'minin, rhymes with the end of verse 176, وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ. So the public address rhymes with the private address, so we see a sort of seamless integration in terms of their literary attributes. The effect is that here the audience experience themselves listening to 176 as flies on the wall, listening in to what God sent expressly in response to Muhammad's own emotional and psychological state. So it's a message which, from one perspective, is just for Muhammad, but from the receiver's perspective, they will experience as being given access to an intimate message between God and Muhammad. This verse seems to be also shaped by the Qur'an's That is, the Quranic author is concerned to produce a liturgical text that could be recited in front of and for the community with the aesthetic feature of rhyme, and which would, perhaps augmented by the aesthetic feature of the text, achieve certain effects on the audience. Indeed, in light of everything that is going on here, both in terms of the messages being communicated through this mise en scène to the audience, and in terms of the literary form in which they are communicated, one begins to suspect that there is something more and perhaps something different going on than a response to Muhammad's psychological state at a certain moment in the city of Medina. Something similar might be stated about the last verse on this slide, verse 178. Here the grammatical form is quite similar to what we saw earlier, a third person, what we could call a hortatory declaration. Let not the unbelievers suppose that the indulgence we grant them is better for them. The similarity in form to what we saw in verse 176, again, a third person, this time singular, hortatory declaration, reflects the aesthetic and, again, liturgical concerns of the author. The argument, too, is similar, but it addresses a different problem. Here, the problem is not the rejection of Muhammad by unbelievers, but one can detect the frustration of the believing community. So the Quran is now addressing a problem with the believers and not with Muhammad himself. The frustration of the believing community that their enemies are doing quite well, even though they're enemies of God as well. These opponents are not being punished for their unbelief, but seem to be living the good life. And although this third-person hortatory declaration is formally directed at the unbelievers, it seems to be intended for the believers. The Quran offers them a sort of theodicy to help them through the cognitive dissidence of infidels living the good life. The Quran assures them not only or not simply that God will punish them in the end, but in fact that it is God who has given them the good life. They may think, that is the unbelievers, they may think that their success is due to their own virtue or their own virtuosity, but they think wrong. God has willed their success as part of a larger scheme, so that they may carry on with their sin and then be punished for that sin. Something that later Muslim theologians will call istidraj. In what follows, the Quranic author turns to a different argument, and I'll pull up these slides as well. A message meant to inculcate certain dispositions and practices. Verse 179 is meant, it seems, not to reassure believers, which we saw in verse 178, to comfort them in response to the problem of unbelievers living the good life, but verse 179 is not meant to reassure them or comfort them, but rather to trouble them, or at least to provoke them to examine their own dispositions. Here the divine voice announces that God shall distinguish the corrupt, you see that on the second line of verse 179, khabith is the Arabic word, from the good, that is, the corrupt from the good within the believing community. The point, according to the study Quran, is that the believers, quote, will not be left mixed together with the hypocrites and disbelievers. Now, they raise hypocrites, munafiqun, following tafsir, but I wonder if this does the trick in this case, invoking a category of munafiqun, which actually does not appear in this passage or anywhere in the surah, orients one towards thinking that a formal, if secret, clandestine clan existed surreptitiously within the believers' community in Medina. But I propose that what the Quranic author has in mind here is more ambiguous. The Quran is not announcing that a secret community is already present, embedded in the midst of the believing community, which God will eventually triage out of it. Instead, it means to destabilize the entire community, a complacent community with a general warning. Do not think that you are safe simply because you are inside the community. You will not be saved by your identification or affiliation with a group. You will not be saved, one might say, by a label. Verse 180 then suggests that there are members of the community who are not giving to its leaders as they should. Indeed, the Quran follows this up with a threat that misers, so it's bukhala, it's in the verb yabkhaluna, misers will not avoid God's judgment. On the contrary, they will be singled out for their miserliness and condemned on the day of resurrection. And you can read through that on verse 180. The Quran then creatively and very purposefully inserts in the next verse a reference to miserliness, although now by adding direct speech. So we're now in verse 181 on the bottom of the slide. The Quran then has a group declare, well, I'll give you just a larger excerpt. God has heard the saying of those who said, surely God is poor and we are rich. We shall write down what they have said, and they're slaying the prophets without right, and we shall say, again, taste the chastisement of the burning, which we've heard in different forms earlier in this section of the surah. Now, most tafsirs insist that the Jews are meant by this verse. That is, we have a quotation of something the Jews have said, and indeed, most commentators say that this verse responds to the response of Jews to Quran chapter 2 al-Baqarah verse 245 and 57 verse 11, where we have two verses which have an exhortation to give a goodly loan, qaradan hasanan, to God. And then this is supposed to be the direct speech quoted here in Surah Al-Imran, what the Jews said in response to one or both of those declarations that are recorded in different surahs. Now, as Sherry Lowen argues in her article, mostly focused on the saying on the saying that the hand of God is tied, attributed to the Jews, they are likely right. That is, I do think that the Jews are invoked and that the commentators are right about this, since the accusation in this verse of killing the prophet seems to be directed in every other occasion in the Quran against the Jews. As I've argued elsewhere in an article entitled Very Words, the nature of the counter discourse, for example, that which we find in verse 181, is telling. And Mehdi Azayas has already said most of this, so he deserves the credit, or maybe the blame if you disagree with this idea. The nature of the counter discourse is telling. In fact, in almost every occasion when opponents of the Quranic prophet are quoted in direct speech in the Quran, they speak as a group, in unison, not as an individual. The effect is to create a sort of eschatological division that is present here and now. The world is already divided between two groups, the believers who are being exhorted and the general group of unbelievers who always speak in unison, almost as a chorus. This would suggest that what we have is not a verbatim transcript of conversations, since people usually do not speak in chorus. So perhaps this is not, in fact, a transcript of a conversation in Medina, but rather a sort of mise en scène meant for the purpose of the exhortation. Now, even if the Jews are quoted in verse 181, my argument is that the concern of the Quran here is not the Jews, but once again, the insiders, the community. The Jews in their insolent saying are brought up to teach the believers a lesson. Do not be misers in God's cause, lest you end up like that group of Jews who had that insolent saying and who will be condemned. 2 verses later, so on to the next slide. 2 verses later, we find a second reference, perhaps also related to the Jews. I skipped over a verse there, you will notice. In verse 183 now, but this time about incredulity. Again, we have a counter discourse, and a very interesting one. And as usual, the opponents of the Quranic prophet speak in unison. They speak of, in Arbery's translation, a covenant. There you see in the Arabic the word is ahd. And one might question whether covenant is the best translation. in this case, when one sees sort of what is at stake with the direct quotation of this group here. In any case, we have this reference to an ahad, so a reference to a covenant that this group has made with God, that he will indicate to them, or sort of signal to them, a true prophet by consuming an offering by fire. And you can see the Arabic there, the reference to fire eating the sacrifice, which is here qurban. It's an interesting word, qurban, that's used in this verse. It appears 3 times in the Qur'an. It's cognate with a standard expression in both Syriac and Aramaic. I'll return to that at that point. But the interesting point is that this is the test of a true prophet, namely that this prophet will bring an offering that will be consumed by fire. By this way of thinking, this back and forth was a matter for Muhammad, because we can see that they are challenging Muhammad's prophethood on this basis. And again, in verse 184, we have an address, second person singular. Thank you, Arbery, for the. And again, a sort of comfort to Muhammad in light of the Jewish insistence that true prophets have spectacular miracles like fire coming down from the sky. Now, the study Qur'an, referring to different tafsirs, including Tabari and Qurtubi, relates, the commentators describe a challenge posed to the Prophet by some prominent Jews who asked him to prepare a sacrificial offering that would be consumed by a fire from heaven. Now, this exchange is made to be part of the Qur'an, of course, and it's very interesting to note that the way the study Qur'an presents it as a conversation one day in Medina is not a feature of the direct speech that we had earlier in verse 181. In that case, in verse 181, we don't have a setting or mise en scène in which something is being said to Muhammad, but simply an affirmation that God knows how the Jews presumably say, God is poor and we are rich. So presumably the Jews say God is poor and we are rich, but they might have said it among themselves in their own houses. We do not find a qul statement in which God then instructs Muhammad how he is to respond to the direct speech in 181. But we do find that in 183, where God, sort of attentive to hearing this direct speech of this Jewish group, according to the study Quran in Medina, then intervened by telling Muhammad, listen, here's how I want you to respond to this group of Jews who said this sort of thing. By the way, despite that, we do have sebeb accounts for verse 181 that tell stories of a Jew, usually named Phinehas, as Sherry Lowen has described, for the direct speech in verse 181. Very interesting stories that involve also Abu Bakr. To return to verse 183, the reference to an offering consumed by fire is, in my opinion, almost certainly a reflection of the account of the prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, which is in the biblical book 1 Kings chapter 18, although for what it's worth, there are a number of accounts of prophets or prophetic-like figures in the Hebrew Bible who have their offerings consumed by fire. There's a great account in the book of Judges where a figure known as Gideon has an offering. An angel visits him, instructs him how to prepare the offering. Fire comes down from the sky and consumes it. So, maybe that's important too, that this is not just one story in the Hebrew Bible, but there are multiple stories, and so one can see it as a motif or a topos or some word like that. By the way, also, in the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, there's this allusion to killing the prophets in verse 183. It's not really clear in the verse that the reference to a sacrifice consumed by fire is a reference or includes the story of the Jews killing a prophet. But in the Elijah story, of course, the Jews do not kill Elijah, but there are references to the murder of prophets in that story. If you know it, this will be maybe redundant, but there's evil King Ahab, who's basically sided with the evil priests of Baal. There's this competition, like a showdown. where they each have their sacrifices. Elijah, of course, wins. His sacrifice is consumed by fire. Things don't really go well, so he ends up fleeing all the way to Mount Horeb. And then he has a communication from God in which Elijah says, well, they've killed all the prophets, and I'm the only one that's left. So there could be there could be even more sort of reflections with this subtext of this Qur'anic verse. And anyway, the Qur'an does not say, why did you kill him, Elijah, but rather, why did you kill or slay? Again, thank you, Arbery, although my children now use the word slay a lot in a different context. That's not important right now. So why did you slay them, which takes up a general topos of the Jews, or better, the Israelites, as prophet killers already found in the New Testament, Jesus' lamentation over the city of Jerusalem, and in latent Christian writings. There's a text known as the Stories of the Prophets, not Islamic Qisas al-Anbiya, but a Byzantine Stories of the Prophets, which brings this up. Nora, I think I like 7 minutes, if that's okay. Yeah? Okay, thank you. Okay, so it is interesting that the Quran uses Qurban. As I mentioned, it does appear elsewhere in the Quran. It appears, I believe, in the Ma'idah account with the two sons of Adam, and somewhere else, maybe Ahqaf, also in a different context. But it is interesting that Qurban is used here. And so you can find it there in verse 183. As I mentioned before, it is the standard Aramaic Syriac term for a ritual sacrifice in the Christian context for the Eucharist, but also used in Jewish Aramaic. So one has a sense of a serious engagement with this Jewish Christian subtext of the Quran. In any case, the point of verse 183 and verse 184 is to make an argument for Muhammad on the basis of the proofs that he brings forward. Right? The problem is he hasn't brought forward a spectacular miracle. People are using this as an excuse to reject his prophetic claims. Why can't you bring down fire from the sky like Elijah did? And the Quran responds to this with this message of comfort, again, to Muhammad himself. Again, the believing community hearing Al-Imran is privileged by being a listener or an onlooker to this intimate scene between God and Muhammad. And the message in verse 184 affirms to Muhammad, but maybe again, the intended audience is the believing community, that there were earlier prophets who were denied. And it's key to see what these prophets bring. In verse 184, they came with clear signs, the Psalms and the book illuminating. Now you see the word signs and you might think, oh, these are mu'jizat, these are miracles. But it seems clear that the bayyinat, the reference to bayyinat wa zubur wal kitab, is a reference to divine proclamations. So earlier prophets brought divine proclamations, as you have done, Muhammad. They too were denied, maybe with an excuse that they didn't have a spectacular miracle either. Does that make sense, what's going on here? By the way, I love you, Arbery, but he translates here the plural word zubur as psalms, which I think is definitely wrong. He's not the only one to translate this as psalms. I was speaking to Ilka about this as we were taking the bus up to Oxford. It seems clearly to be simply related to a word which, at least in ancient South Arabian, just means writings. So it would be an allusion simply to proclamations or scriptures and not connected to David in any special way. Actually, have questions even about the singulars of word, but we don't have to go there. By the way, someone mentioned yesterday this verse. I forget who it was now. Sorry, I should give you credit. But from Quran 35, al-Fatir, as the transliteration is wrong, there, which is almost identical to verse 184. So that's interesting that we have this sort of doublet between these two verses. But once again, these three categories of divine proclamations as clear signs, psalms, which is not psalms, rather writings, and the illuminating book. Okay, on to verse 186, and we are, the good news is we're rapidly approaching the end of my talk, the good news for you. Okay, so verse 186 returns to the theme of generosity, which we saw earlier in the discourse about miserliness, and pairs to it an allusion to what believers, quote, do with their own lives. I don't think I can make a compelling case right now. It would need a little bit of work, but I see this as an allusion to a willingness to participate in the military campaigns of the believing community. So there are two sort of demands in terms of practice from the believing community. One is to be generous in supporting financially the believing community, and one is to be willing to join its military campaigns. This pair suggests that the author, that is between being generous and giving one's own life in military action, suggests that the author again hopes to give the audience a reason to be generous and a reason to fight. There is also an allusion here to possible opposition from the people of the book and from the mushrikun, which is sort of interesting here in this context of a traditionally Medinan surah. In verse 187, there is again a reference in Arbery, so this is why we should all learn Arabic, to covenant, but it's a different word, mithaq in this case, and this time it is a true covenant. I mean, here actually should give Arbery credit because he uses compact, I guess, to distinguish mithaq from ahad here. But here it brings to bear the Qur'an's interest in defending Muhammad's prophethood on the last page here. In light of what precedes and follows, the bit that the people of the book have tossed behind their backs or rejected it behind their backs is, in my opinion, likely a reference to those allusions or predictions of Muhammad in their own scripture. That's what they've tossed behind their backs. Now, keeping in mind that generally in late antiquity, there are two tests to prove that someone is a prophet. One is that they have miracles, and we saw this was basically what's at stake in the first part of the section, and another is that they're predicted in earlier scriptures. We see this in a lot of Christian apologetics for the case of Jesus as the Christ. And in fact, the tafsirs generally agree with this, and here I'm in line with the study Qur'an by saying that what's at stake here are scriptural predictions of Muhammad that Jews and Christians are ignoring. Okay, on to verse 189. Let me pull up all of the text as well. Okay, so by the way, quickly on 189 to 191, which Julien spoke about yesterday. It's just important to note here the way in which there's an engagement, as Julien has pointed out, with a piety and asceticism common with Christians. Actually, it's a kind of a complicated passage structurally, so I would need Mariana and Nikolai to help me think through this, but there's a way in which 191 joins the previous section, but it also begins the following section, which is very distinct because it has 5 successive statements with this invocation or prayer to God, Rabbana, 5 times, Rabbana, our Lord, and it's framed as an address of the believer to, or the believers to God. So very unusually for the Qur'an, God is addressed in the second person. You might compare this to the second part of the Fatiha. And in fact, in some ways, if you look at the content of the messages here, people like to say, the Fatiha is like the Lord's Prayer, these kind of vibe, these two things. But this has much more Lord's Prayer vibe, I think, in Al-Imran. It's probably not important for my argument and maybe a needless distraction, but I can't take it back because I've already said it. And I'm being recorded. So, okay, finally, the last verse. We can carry on to the last verse that I'll really speak about here, which is 199. There is verse 200 in the surah, of course, as well. This is especially important to the argument, for the Qur'an explicitly declares that a group of the people of the book are righteous. Some of them are righteous, min ahl al-kitab. There is no sign that these Jews or Christians are converts. They are righteous as people of the book. And one might think of the sort of scene vividly portrayed in Al-Ma'idah verses 82 to 83, there's affirmation of the Christians and the ruhban and qasisin for the humility. And then verse 183 speaks of them crying, their eyes filling up with tears when they hear what has been revealed to Muhammad or what he has proclaimed. And even though the commentaries usually say they then become Muslims, the text doesn't say that. And here too, there's no indication that these Jews or Christians have become Muslims. They are righteous not because they have a new label, but above all, for their belief in the new messages, and that they were not precluded from believing in the new messages given to Muhammad by their belief in their own book. Even more, the Qur'an actually seems to promise them a reward in paradise for their, if you follow through to the end of the verse there, the mercantile language of wage, which I'll return to in the concluding aside. Ajr is the Arabic word here. This is very interesting if we compare it to verse 180. I won't go all the way back there, but there, some of the believing community who have the right label are condemned to hell for their miserliness. That they were miserly, they shall have, that they were miserly with, finally got it, that they were miserly with, they shall have hung about their necks on the resurrection day. We should keep in mind, though, that the surah is not universally positive about the people of the book, because in verse 72, again, here it's a group, I think ta'ifa is the Arabic word, another group of the people of the book are condemned. Okay, finally to the conclusion. I'm not going to read through these bullet points. I'll just put them up there and then read my one paragraph of conclusion. The point of all of this is, in my opinion, not to create a catalog listing who is going to paradise and who is going to hell, but rather to exhort obedience to the Prophet and to his movement or his community. Verse 199 is in some ways the cherry on the cake of this section, for it shows most clearly that the Qur'an's author, with this mise en scène, is concerned with making a dramatic case for the new prophet and obedience to his movement. This section of Quran 3 then appears to me to be well understood in the genre of homiletics and to have a particular concern with community formation. Thank you.